I love that picture.
It's one of the good ones.
Yeah, there's John Lind. That's Rick Wright. Do you know Rick? He's the one who gave us that,
Yep.
his buttons and his rifle and all that stuff not too long ago. And all the Willow Lake Creamery stuff also, which is fabulous.
Yeah, Rick is a brother of the guy that owned Whiskey River, Bob Wright. And Rick is the son of Jim Wright. Jim Wright gave us his World War II equipment and brought in some nice stuff. The Wrights go back to the earliest years of Nicollet County.
And the banner that we see there right behind him is the one that we have in the collection. We have that DAR banner.
We do.
The
so Bob, did William Wrinkle, oh sorry,
didn't fine.
So did William Wrinkle have this grocery store before he started the photo collection? I mean the
oh, you're thinking of the photographer. No, that's a different individual.
Different guy?
Yeah. Yeah, there was more than one Wrinkle.
You can get the wrinkle rundown from Eileen.
This,
I missed the wrinkle rundown.
Yeah, it's long and complicated.
That doesn't surprise me.
We've got plenty of information in the genealogy files. I was going to say this particular store stood on the west side of the 100 block between the Johnson and Company building along Broadway and the Nicollet Hotel along Park Row. It was fairly close to the middle of the block, and it stood until the late 1950s, and then it was torn down along with neighboring buildings until the only buildings left were the Nicollet Hotel and the Johnson Overall building. You know, I see earlier that there's a guy named Steve Ziesmer, and that, I believe, is my old friend from Rochester that I knew very well back then. And I haven't seen or heard from him since I left Rochester in the year 2000. He's originally from North Mankato and knew my uncle who ran the hardware store in North Mankato that Dave Much later purchased from my uncle. I'm not sure who else is out there. I can only see Jessica and Ruth on my screen, so I don't know how many people we've got here, but
Steve and Cindy are the other two who are with us right now. We're right at 10. I'll keep watching to see if anybody else pops on. We usually have a few. But Ruth, if you want to go, we can get rolling here. We're already recording, so.
okay.
All right, I'm gonna do this real quick. I've got a weird bout of laryngitis that came on this weekend, so I'm a little squeaky, but bear with me. So thanks everybody for coming to the History Hangout today to learn a little bit about the history of the military story here in Nicollet County. If you don't mind, we have just a couple of housekeeping items here. Please mute if you're not talking. We highly encourage participation and questions and comments. But if you're just hanging out to listen, feel free to hit that mute button. We're here to learn from you too, which is why we encourage participation. We love hearing stories from everybody, so please share. If you have something like a photo of something you want to share, let Ruth or myself know. We're co-hosting today. or throw it in the chat. You are welcome to upload anything into the chat. And as I said before, we're already recording. This will be available afterwards. We'll throw it up on our YouTube channel. Yes, we have a YouTube channel. And it'll also go in the discussion in the Facebook event. We just have it housed there for safekeeping as well. And with that, I will mute myself and we will turn this over to Ruth and Bob.
I think what I'll do is read extensively from a presentation that I gave some years ago to a group of veterans at their annual meeting over in Nicollet. And while I was preparing for this presentation, I thought, there's a lot of good stuff in here. So I think I'll just go ahead and start reading this. The entire thing would take, I think, probably beyond an hour, but I'll dive in here. Nicollet County has a long tradition of military service. Soldiers came to the county very early in its history. A strong military presence began with the construction of Fort Ridgely in 1853, the same year in which the county was created. Companies C, E, and K of the 6th United States Infantry Regiment were the first to occupy the fort. Just over 45 square miles comprised the area reserved as the military reservation. While the trip to Fort Ridgely could be made by steamboat, the distance, approximately 250 miles, was much longer than the overland route. In March of 1857, a group of Indians led by Inkpaduta killed 34 settlers, mostly women and children, near Spirit Lake. Troops from Fort Ridgely attempted to find and capture the Indians, but failed to do so. It was a bitter disappointment to the soldiers at the fort because it meant that they had failed in their mission to protect the settlers. You have to remember that those were infantry soldiers, not cavalry soldiers, and that was a big part of the reason why they were not able to track the Indians who had committed the murders at Spirit Lake. In spite of several attempts over the years, Inkpaduta and his followers were never captured. Among the soldiers who served at Fort Ridgely were such men as Bernard B., the officer who became famous during the Civil War for giving Confederate General Thomas Jackson the nickname of Stonewall, Stonewall Jackson. John Pemberton, later the Confederate general who surrendered Vicksburg to General Grant, was also stationed at the fort. And Pemberton was not at all happy when he surrendered to Grant. When the two of them met, it was not a good reunion. Another officer stationed there was Lewis Armistead, who died as a Confederate general at the head of his troops as he reached the Union battle line along Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg. Interestingly enough, as Armistead was dying, he inquired about his good friend, Union General Hancock, who was leading the Union troops and is credited with saving the Union Army at Gettysburg. And some years after the Civil War, Hancock was a guest of Henry Sibley, and Sibley and Hancock came down to Nicollet County to do some hunting around Swan Lake. The Civil War began with the attack on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. President Lincoln called for volunteers on April 15th, but it was not until Saturday, the 19th, that the people of the county heard about either the attack or Lincoln's proclamation. On Sunday, E. St. Julian Cox, a lawyer, and Jeremiah C. Donahower, a St. Peter businessman, began to gather recruits for the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment. 17 men responded that day, and by noon on Wednesday, the total had risen to more than 80. I should note that I live across the street from the Cox House, which is a property owned and maintained by the Nicollet County Historical Society. Asgrim Scarrow, a Norwegian immigrant and one of the founders of St. Peter, was elected captain. Cox was elected as 1st lieutenant, and Donahauer was chosen as 2nd lieutenant. The unit was called the St. Peter Guards. And you might notice that I said that the officers were chosen. At the time, it was common practice for the officers to be selected by the men who volunteered to serve in a military unit. A man named David Donaldson made the trip to St. Paul on horseback in 24 hours to offer the troops to Governor Ramsey. But Donaldson arrived an hour too late for the entire group to become members of one of the 10 companies in the 1st Minnesota. When Donaldson returned to St. Peter, about 25 or 30 men from the St. Peter Guards went to St. Paul and joined the 1st Minnesota. The remaining men were sent by steamboat to Governor Ramsey to Fort Ridgely in June of 1861 for training by the regular Army troops stationed there. They were also deployed at various times over large areas south and west of the fort to protect settlers from Indians who were threatening to attack them because of problems were entitled in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux in 1851. On July 5th, the men were mustered in as members of Company E of the 2nd Minnesota Infantry Regiment. Scarrow, Cox, and Donahauer continued to serve as the officers in the renamed unit. It was not until October 3rd that the men of Company E were gathered with the other companies of the regiment at Fort Snelling. From there, they were sent to Kentucky, where 12 men were killed and 33 were wounded in the Battle of Mill Springs on January 19th, 1862. Cox and Scarrow resigned for health reasons early in 1862, and Donahauer became Company E's captain. 2 sergeants from the company were commissioned as lieutenants. The 2nd Minnesota participated in the siege of Corinth in Mississippi and in the battles at Chickamauga and Missionary Ridge before watching the burning of Atlanta and joining General Sherman on the march to the sea. The regiment fought to capture Savannah and marched in the Grand Review in Washington, D.C. on May 24, 1865, at the end of the war. Men from Nicollet County were found in each of the 11 volunteer infantry regiments raised by the state of Minnesota. Other Minnesota units in which men from the county served included the 1st Regiment of Heavy Artillery, the 1st Mounted Rangers, Brackett's Battalion of Cavalry, and the 2nd Cavalry. Asgrim Scarrow returned to service later in 1862 after recovering from his earlier illness. He became the captain of Company D of the 9th Minnesota Infantry Regiment. An article in the May 9th, 1863 issue of the St. Peter Tribune reads as follows: "The flag recently ordered by the ladies of our town for Captain Scarrow's company arrived on Thursday morning and will be forwarded as soon as possible to its destination. It is made of silk with the gold bars in full number on the blue square and the words from the Ladies of St. Peter, Company D, 9th Regiment, Minnesota Volunteers, in gilt letters, worked on the stripes. On the lower edge is the following motto: protect our flag and deal death to traitors. We are mistaken in Company D if this injunction is not strictly obeyed. Scarrow commanded Company D until his death in the Battle of Nashville on December 16, 1864. Contrary to the usual practice, and indicating the great respect the men of his company had for Captain Scarrow, his body was returned to St. Peter for burial. A large white obelisk marks the gravesite in Green Hill Cemetery along Sunrise Drive here in St. Peter. One Civil War soldier from Nicollet County won the Medal of Honor. His name was William Clark, a corporal in Company H of the 2nd Minnesota. On February 15, 1863, Clark was one of 16 soldiers who successfully defended a wagon train from an attack by 125 cavalry troopers. Although born in Pennsylvania, Clark had lived in Blue Earth County prior to the Civil War, but moved to Nicollet County in 1869, where he died on January 9, 1916, at the age of 87. Clark did not receive his Medal of Honor until September 11th, 1897. Clark is buried in Hebron Cemetery in Nicollet Township. It was not unusual for such extreme delays in awarding the Medal of Honor. That was true for other men who were in the same unit as Clark. They received theirs late as well. Another interesting story involving men from Nicollet County deals with brothers from the Magner family. Two of the Magner brothers, Michael and James, arrived in the county in 1852. So that was even before the county was formally created in 1853. And according to the book, History of the Minnesota Valley, James was in charge of the Indian farms at Redwood Agency, that'd be beyond Fort Ridgely, from 1854 until 1861. When the Civil War began, James became a lieutenant on the staff of General Thomas W. Sherman, an officer who had once been stationed at Fort Ridgely. Now, this is not William T. Sherman, the one that everybody knows. This is Thomas W. Sherman. Magner participated in the capture of Port Royal, South Carolina in November of 1861, but transferred to General Burnside's division in the Army of the Potomac in the summer of 1862. Magner became the captain of Company I of the 28th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, which contained many Irish immigrants like the Magners. James Magner was quite a linguist because he spoke English, French, Sioux, and Gaelic. When some of his men were criticizing Magner in Gaelic, soon after he had joined the 28th, Magner surprised them and gave them a thorough chewing out in that Irish language. Magner fought with the 28th at Second Bull Run, Chantilly, South Mountain, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. In December of 1862, the 28th was transferred to the famous Irish Brigade of the Second Corps. In the terrible Battle of Fredericksburg, the Irish Brigade had over 500 casualties. On July 2nd, 1863, the Irish Brigade lost about 200 of its approximately 500 men in the fighting in the wheat field at Gettysburg. James Magner was among the wounded. He was back on active duty by the spring of 1864. On May 18th, he was killed, sword in hand, leading troops in battle at Spotsylvania, Virginia. Because so many men were killed, many were buried in mass graves, and James Magner apparently being one of them. James had several brothers. Among them was one named Matthew, who also came to Nicollet County for a short time. But he didn't like to farm, and he apparently didn't care much for the climate here. So he headed south sometime before the Civil War. Matthew found work in the South and supported the Southern cause when the war began. He became a lieutenant in Company D of the 43rd Battalion of the Virginia Cavalry, a unit that is better known as Mosby's Rangers. The Rangers were a very effective, irregular military unit that caused the Union Army lots of trouble. Matthew eventually found himself, like his brother, participating in the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863, and like his brother, was wounded in the fighting there. Matthew did survive the war, but he died from a combination of the effects of his wound at Gettysburg and yellow fever in Mississippi in 1866. It is not known with certainty where he was buried, but his body may have been returned to Minnesota and buried in the Magner family plot in Calvary Cemetery along Sunrise Drive in St. Peter. The name Matthew is on the large Celtic cross that marks the burial site, which gives support for the possibility that he's actually buried there. The Nicollet County Historical Society has James Magner's Civil War uniform jacket, as well as several photographs of him that Ruth is showing. And the Magners are connected with the Lambert family here in St. Peter. And I can tell you that Bob Lambert had a very distinguished military career as a helicopter pilot in the Vietnam War. But continuing with the Civil War, some of you may know that a draft was held for the first time in the history of this county in order to fill the ranks of the Union Army during the Civil War. The October 21, 1863 issue of the St. Peter Tribune states that the quota for Nicollet County was 39 men. By 1863, the rate at which men were volunteering for service had dropped off sharply. Bounties were paid to those who enlisted. If an individual did not want to serve, he could hire someone to take his place. This was a common practice throughout the northern states. The October 21st Tribune also contains the following notice: enlist or be drafted. Colonel W.H. Meyer and Captain I. Brockman have received commissions to enlist for the new cavalry regiment. The draft will take place next Sunday. Those that volunteer will get the $100 bounty besides other rewards. Those that are drafted will not be dealt with so well, however, and will have to go, saying is obvious. Ruth has on the screen now a wonderful photo from our collection at the Historical Society. It shows long after the Civil War, a group of veterans from the war in front of one of the now disappeared buildings in the business district of St. Peter. We know the names of many of the members of the group, and what's of particular interest is the banner that is on display in the back of the group there. After the Civil War ended in the 1880s, an organization called the Grand Army of the Republic was part of a nationwide group of Civil War veterans, and the unit of the Grand Army of the Republic that was here in St. Peter was named after Asgrim Scarrow. So it was the Asgrim Scarrow Post number 37 here in St. Peter. And the banner that I mentioned is part of that Grand Army of the Republic organization. It'd be analogous to the Veterans of Foreign Wars organization or the American Legion organization that were formed in the 1900s. And what's of interest here is the fact that the Nicollet County Historical Society has that banner in its collection, as well as the original charter of the Grand Army of the Republic post here in St. Peter, and its records, its membership lists, and quite a number of other documents as well. So we know quite a bit about who in Nicollet County had served in the Civil War, and we know quite a bit about the people who belonged to the Grand Army of the Republic from Nicollet County. While the Civil War was being fought, the Dakota Uprising in 1862 resulted in significant military activity throughout the county. Settlers fled their homes and farms to take shelter wherever possible. Many in the western portions of the county naturally went to Fort Ridgely. Others went to New Ulm, Mankato, and St. Peter. The Dakota attacked Fort Ridgely on August 20th and on August 22nd, 1862. Both attacks failed, largely due to the very effective use of artillery under the direction of experienced regular Army soldiers. This was in spite of the fact that the fort was not protected by surrounding walls. It sat on a flat piece of prairie, not far from ravines in which the Dakota gathered to prepare for their attacks. Had the Dakota warriors been able to launch a well-coordinated attack, the fort would have fallen easily. By failing to take Fort Ridgely and nearby New Ulm, the Dakota uprising was doomed. Volunteers and soldiers gathered in St. Peter under General Henry Sibley, a fur trader who had become the state's first governor. Colonel Samuel McPhail brought 175 mounted volunteers from St. Peter to Fort Ridgely on August 27th. Sibley arrived at the fort the next day with over 1,000 men, including soldiers of the 6th Minnesota Infantry Regiment. Sibley went on to defeat the Dakota, who were then forced to leave the state of Minnesota. Fort Ridgely was no longer needed, and by 1867 was abandoned by the Army. And I should add that the Nicollet County Historical Society has copies of the roster lists of those who served during the Dakota Uprising and who fought in the Civil War. A large number of civilians from southern Minnesota formed militia units during the Dakota Uprising. The roster lists include their names as well. Such units came from St. Peter, Northland, Lafayette, Le Sueur, Mankato, and many other communities. And the list can be found in one of the volumes titled Minnesota in the Civil and Indian Wars, which was published in the late 1800s. And the set has been reprinted with an index by the Minnesota Historical Society. It's also online. And I can tell you that I have a great-great-grandfather who was in the Scandinavian Guards from the Northland area at that time. In 1883, Company I of the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the Minnesota National Guard was organized in St. Peter. J.C. Donahauer, who I mentioned earlier, had been a captain in the 2nd Minnesota Infantry Regiment during the Civil War, served as the captain of the new Company I. 3 future officials of state government, all from St. Peter, served in the regiment, holding various ranks over the years. Gideon S. Ives began as the 1st lieutenant and eventually served as the regiment's major. Ives later became one of Minnesota's lieutenant governors. John A. Johnson held the rank of 1st sergeant when the regiment was created, but went on to serve twice as the unit's captain. He later was elected as governor of Minnesota 3 times. Julius H. Block began as one of the regiment's corporals and later served several terms as state treasurer. Company I was disbanded in 1893. The Historical Society has artifacts, photographs, and considerable information about Company I in its collections. When the Spanish-American War began in 1898, Philip Pearson organized 65 men into a company for military service, but enough men were already available throughout the nation, so their services were not needed. However, Oliver Quan, Frank Magner, and other Nicollet County men did serve in various units of the Minnesota National Guard during the conflict. It was not until 1908 that a new company was formed in St. Peter following authorization by Governor Johnson to create 9 infantry companies in Minnesota. St. Peter's new unit was Company K, part of the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the Minnesota National Guard. Oliver Quan became the unit's captain. Francis Magner served as the 1st lieutenant, and Charles Key served as the 2nd lieutenant. Ruth had shown a slide showing the Company K soldiers lined up across Minnesota Avenue. You can see the spire of the courthouse on the far left there. I'm guessing that this postcard was probably created when the unit was brand new in 1908. These are the types of uniforms that they were wearing back at that time. Then the next photo that Ruth had, there you go, that one. This deals with something that I'll discuss in a moment. So if Ruth, you want to hold that, I'll come to it in just a couple sentences here. In 1911, the legislature of the state of Minnesota passed a law to build 3 armories in Minnesota each year. The armory dedicated in St. Peter in 1913 was the first of the state's new armories to be completed and dedicated. It became the home of Company K. That building is still standing on the east side of the 400 block of South Minnesota Avenue here in St. Peter. When Pancho Villa began raids across the Mexican border into the United States, robbing and killing a number of American citizens, regular Army units and many National Guard units were sent to various locations along the border in 1916. And the picture that Ruth has on the screen now shows some of the men from Company K, part of the Minnesota National Guard, walking along Minnesota Avenue on their way to the railroad depot across the Minnesota River to board a train to take them eventually down to a place in Texas. We've got a tremendous amount of information about the men of Company K, we've got their ledgers and membership lists, and we've got an enormous amount of information about their experiences along the border between the United States and Mexico, thanks to a correspondent who was a member of Company K who sent back detailed articles which were published in one of the St. Peter newspapers. Company K was sent to Lowell Grande, Texas, where they remained for several months before returning to Minnesota in January of 1917. My grandfather was one of those, and I have some of the items that he brought back from that area. The unit was called out several times, but saw no combat. Hilding Johnson died from an illness while the unit was deployed along the border, becoming the company's only casualty. The men of Company K were not home very long before the United States entered World War I on April 6, 1917. The company was mobilized on July 15th and was sent to Camp Cody at Deming, New Mexico on August 19th. B.M. Cosgrove was the captain, Francis Schmidt was the first lieutenant, and C.M. Callahan was the second lieutenant. Most of the 150 men on the roster list came from St. Peter and nearby communities. I should add that we have a tremendous amount of information about the men from Nicollet County who served in World War I. We have a box that contains a set of pre-printed forms that are about the size of recipe cards, and the forms have the names and addresses and quite a bit of information about each individual who signed up for service in World War I from Nicollet County. Interestingly enough, we see that a number of the people came from other states, and I believe there are even at least one that came from Canada. And after I thought about this for a while, I realized that some of these men were probably students at Gustavus that just decided that they would enlist here in Nicollet County rather than return to their home states or back to Canada to enlist. Company K was used as a source of replacements for other units during the war. Many of its soldiers were sent overseas as members of other units. Many were involved in some of the worst fighting in which American soldiers were involved, including the battles of the Meuse-Argonne, Saint-Mihiel, and the Aisne-Marne. Several were killed. Others died from illnesses. The worldwide flu pandemic of 1918 killed some of these men. Among those who served in the First World War was Oliver Quan, who had been among the founders of Company K in 1908. He was promoted to the rank of major 5 years later. Quan saw service along the Mexican border in 1916 and went to France in World War I as the commander of the 4th Anti-Aircraft Machine Gun Battalion. He fought in the Meuse-Argonne offensive and in the Lorraine sector. After the war, Quan became a lieutenant colonel in the Officers Reserve Corps. From 1907 to 1925, he was the co-publisher of the St. Peter Herald with H.J. Essler. I remember meeting a descendant of Quan who told me how to properly pronounce his name. It's spelled Quane, and I had been pronouncing it as Quain, but that turned out to be incorrect. One of the Nicollet County men who died in World War I was William R. Whitty, who was born in Oshawa. Private Whitty was wounded in the hip by a machine gun bullet during an attack on Mount Blanc Ridge on October 3rd, 1918, not much more than a month before the end of the war. The American Legion Post number 37 in St. Peter is named for him. Of interest is the fact that the organizational meeting of the St. Peter Legion was held on March 21, 1919, which was the same date as the first meeting of the American Legion in France. The St. Peter Post number 37 is the same number as the earlier Grand Army of the Republic Post named for Asram Scarrow. While Ruth was flipping through the photos here, if you'd go back to Herman Turner, there, Herman was a cousin of mine. I never knew him because this photo was probably taken around 1908 when Company K was new. I selected this photo because it's a good example of what the Company K early uniforms looked like. You can see the Minnesota on the lapel of the uniform. Then you can see the crossed rifles that symbolize infantry beside the word Minnesota on the lapel. You can also see infantry at the top of Herman's hat. So, and getting back to the narrative here, while World War I was still raging, Company E of the 6th Battalion of the Minnesota National Guard was formed in St. Peter. These men were discharged in August of 1918, and Company B of the 5th Infantry Regiment of the Minnesota National Guard was organized in its place. In 1921, the unit was reconstituted as the headquarters company of the 1st Battalion of the 5th Infantry Regiment of the Minnesota National Guard. That lasted until 1923, when the unit became Company D of the 5th Infantry. Nicollet County National Guardsmen again found themselves deployed away from home in January of 1941. You may remember that American involvement in World War II started in December of 1941. In January of 1941, 98 men from St. Peter's Company left for training at March Field in California. Major Clifford Nutter led the unit. Area men were sent to Kodiak, Alaska, as part of Battery B of the 215th Coast Artillery, later in 1941. And I knew at least 2 of the men who were sent out. One of them was Gordy Johnson, who was employed at the Light and Water Department as foreman. And the other was Bill Carlson, who was a good friend of my parents. And this is the Bill Carlson who founded Carlson Craft in North Mankato, which was later sold to Glenn Taylor and became the Taylor Corp. And I'm sure you know that Glenn Taylor is the billionaire who owns the Taylor Corporation. When the United States was attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor, Albert W. Havemeyer from Cortland was one of the sailors who died. The newspaper announcement says that he was stationed on a U.S. warship. The St. Peter Herald article from February 20th, 1942 mentions that St. Peter had 92 newly appointed air raid wardens, 6 special police, and 72 men in the defense force. It's my guess that 92 air raid wardens were probably enough to provide notice of attacks by German and Japanese aircraft on Nicollet County. So, of course, men from throughout Nicollet County served in all branches of the military and in locations all over the world. Many died. The newspapers of the time have many articles about the men who served. The articles about the men who were killed, wounded, or taken as prisoners of war are especially compelling. I knew a couple of the men who were taken as prisoners of war during World War II. I can remember Earl Fitch. I remember delivering papers at his house when I had my newspaper route. And I can also mention that in World War I, there was a man from St. Peter who had been in the famous Lost Battalion. So there's newspaper articles about him at the Historical Society. Following World War II, Nicollet County men were among those who were involved in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Others served in Operation Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, and other military actions in the Middle East. There are also some interesting individuals that I haven't talked about. Some of the men from Nicollet County have become generals. Ruth had selected an image that she's got in this batch of images here that showed the appointment, the document that appointed William Dodd as a general in the Minnesota Territorial Militia. And looking at Ruth's photos here, it reminds me that I was going to talk a little bit about people like Lyle Pearson. Lyle was a B-17 pilot in World War II who was shot down and taken as a prisoner of war. And I had the great privilege of getting to know Lyle and having him tell about his experiences about his capture and his time in a German POW camp. Lyle brought to the Historical Society for us to digitize photographs and documents that he had. The one on the screen now is the actual record in the German POW camp files that tells about Lyle, gives his name and the fact that he was a pilot and physical description of him and various other information. Lyle had the presence of mind when the war ended to go to the commandant's office and work his way through the file cabinets and retrieve his own file information and bring it home with him. So But he was quite a guy. He had quite an experience. And if you want to back up just a little bit, Ruth, to the image of the World War I uniform, Marlon Peterson and I, some years ago, for an exhibit at the Historical Society, took advantage of the large collection of World War I equipment in the collection at the Historical Society to create this mannequin wearing essentially every piece of equipment that a World War I Army soldier would have had if he were on the front lines. You can see we've got a rifle, the uniform, the ammunition belt, canteen, mask. We've got a bayonet that's on the back of the uniform. What we did is we followed as a reference a drawing that Marlon had that showed each piece of equipment in its proper place on a soldier. And we managed to scrounge up from our collection every item that was in that drawing, including the leggings. The only items we originally were missing were boots, but we found some footwear, so our uniform is now complete. We have a number of World War I uniforms in the museum's collection and a large number of World War II uniforms as well from the different branches of service. I want to mention too another significant figure from Nicollet County, a man named William Carey Brown, who became a brigadier general. Brown was one of the first people to be born in Nicollet County. In fact, he's described as being the second white boy born in Nicollet County in the early 1850s. Brown managed to enter West Point and was an 1877 graduate. He served for 27 years with the 1st Cavalry Regiment, participating in campaigns against the Bannock Indians in 1878 and against the Sioux during the winter of 1890 to 1891. He fought in the Spanish-American War in 1898 as a troop commander in the Santiago campaign and during the Battle of San Juan Hill alongside Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. He was also involved in the Siege of Santiago. And for his actions there, he received the Silver Star. I should add that the Historical Society has a considerable amount of material about General Brown and a number of artifacts that he owned. We have all of his medals that he was awarded during his military career, and it's quite an impressive collection. Serving for 18 months in the newly acquired Philippine Islands after the Spanish-American War, Brown was on the staff of General Funston, the senior Army officer stationed there. Brown became involved in the fighting against guerrillas who were opposed to the American presence in the islands. In 1901, he killed one of the main guerrilla leaders, Tomas Taguntin, who was attempting to escape following his capture. Brown shot him at a distance of 75 yards with a new Colt's automatic pistol. That's pretty extraordinary to hit anything at a distance of 75 yards with a Colt pistol like that. This action was reported by General Funston and was commended by Theodore Roosevelt, who was then the Vice President of the United States. When the most famous of the Philippine guerrillas, Emilio Aguinaldo, was captured, General Funston invited Brown and other staff members to dine with him and Aguinaldo. In 1916, Brown led the 10th Cavalry Regiment into Mexico against Pancho Villa in an attempt to end Pancho Villa's raids into the United States. These black troopers were some of the famous Buffalo soldiers who compiled such distinguished military records. So William Carey Brown was the leader of black cavalry soldiers in the United States Army. Brown had previously met and negotiated with Pancho Villa and had refused demands to turn over captured Mexican leaders to him. During Brown's expedition, he and his men rescued besieged American cavalry troopers in bitter fighting at Parral in April. Brown and his men were under the overall command of General Pershing, but Brown led an independent cavalry unit that traveled 350 miles into Mexico. They successfully fought at Aguas Calientes. When the United States became involved in World War I in 1917, Brown was sent to France the same year with the 42nd Division. This was the famous Rainbow Division, composed of men from throughout the United States. He was later transferred to duty as the assistant to the American Expeditionary Forces Chief Quartermaster. Brown traveled 16,000 miles by automobile while in France as an inspector, checking into matters of supply. He served until December 19, 1918, when he was retired for age from active service. He was the oldest officer in the American Expeditionary Force at the time. He had served more than 45 years and 5 months. For his work during World War I, which saved the government large amounts of money due to his improvements of the supply system, Brown was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. Brown served in every war in which the United States was involved from 1877 to 1918. Work that I'm not going to cover here, but he had a very significant military career. Another soldier I want to talk about quickly is William H. Nutter, part of the large Nutter family from St. Peter. Those of us here in St. Peter know about the Nutter clothing store, which has been around for a very long time. It's part of the same family. William was born in St. Peter in 1902, and upon graduation from West Point in 1925, Nutter began his military career as a second lieutenant of cavalry. His first service was in the famous 7th Cavalry Regiment, the Gary Owens, which George Armstrong Custer led in the 1870s. Nutter went on to attend the cavalry school at Fort Riley, Kansas, before changing to service in logistical units. Following graduation from the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is a pretty prestigious achievement, Nutter served with the 1st Army Division at Fort Knox, Kentucky in 1940. As the Assistant Chief of Staff of the 1st Armored, he was involved in the planning and preparation needed to send the division to North Africa in 1942. This was part of Operation Torch, the first offensive for the American Army on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean. Returning to the United States after the torch duties, Nutter became the Secretary of the General Staff and later the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces Headquarters. This duty began in March of 1943 and ended in January of 1945. And ultimately, Nutter wound up as a major general, and he ended his military career in 1970 after having served in Heidelberg, Germany as the Chief of Staff of the United States Army Europe, and later as the Director of the Army Consul Review Boards. And he died in El Paso, Texas in 1987. I'm showing only a couple minutes left here, so I'll pause to ask if anybody has any questions or comments. Oh, this picture that Ruth has on the screen shows members of Company K. And I didn't know she was going to pick this photo, but it's of particular interest to me because if you look at the word have and you go above the letter E, you'll see the face of a man standing there on the far left of the front row of those who are standing. That's my grandfather, Edmund Sandine, who was sent down to the Mexican border area in 1916. And I have his military service documents and other items from his time there. So I can mention too that in St. Peter, we have the Veterans Memorial in Minnesota Square Park, and the names of many people who were from Nicollet County are inscribed on the memorial, including many of the people that I've talked about in this presentation. During the time of the Vietnam War, I personally knew 7 of those killed from Nicollet County. 2 were high school classmates of mine. One was my partner in my chemistry class, who was in the class ahead of me. Another was a student who was in a class behind me, but I took driver's training with them. And one was a first cousin of mine from North Mankato. So when I visit the Veterans Memorial, I have a personal connection to many of the people who are listed on the memorial. Any comments?
We have a quick question in the chat, if that's okay.
Sure.
Cindy's wondering, are there any good websites to research specific veterans who served in various past wars?
We
don't have our own database. You'd have to ask about a specific veteran.
Now, what's interesting is I mentioned that we had a tremendous amount of material about those who enlisted in World War I. Nita Awesome has indexed that. We haven't posted it online, but when things get back to normal, we should be able to let people peruse Nita's list or look at the actual documents themselves. And I had asked an intern quite a number of years ago when I was working in the archives down there, if she would index the people who were mentioned in the St. Peter newspapers who were serving in the military in World War II. And she didn't finish all of the newspapers because it's such a massive project, but she has an extremely long list of names, and that list is in Excel, so we can easily search by name and then tell you which issue of the newspaper mentions that particular individual. It might be just to mention that the person is serving at a certain location or had been sent to a certain training camp or had been sent overseas to a certain destination, or it might have a fairly lengthy article. Some people were interviewed. My father was interviewed more than once by correspondents, and there's some quite nice interviews of him that appeared in the St. Peter Herald.
And as anniversaries come up as well, we just had this happen with Bob Lambert with his Vietnam service. The Minnesota Historical Society does a lot with interviewing veterans as well. There was a big oral history project that was done recently on Vietnam. The Minnesota Historical Society would also be a great spot to go. A lot of military records are available to see at least some of the basic info, like through the National Archives database. If you have an ancestry membership, a lot of times they'll free up around like Memorial Day, Veterans Day, things like that. That's another way to go. There are various institutions in the area that have library subscriptions to Ancestry, which is a great way to do that research too. North Mankato has one, the Mormon Center over there. What's the name of that? They have I think they have a library subscription to Ancestry.
Yeah.
I think the Blue Earth County Library System at one point did, or at least one of them. There are some around to be accessible. The best place to start, though, of course, Cindy, is local. We have excellent military historians who've compiled a lot of information over the years. So if there's someone specific you have a question about, of course, feel free to reach out to Ruth or Bob, and we'll reach out to the folks, of course, who know a lot of the history. Marlon Peterson would, of course, be a local expert, his brother Marshall as well. A lot of the folks who are serving on the Vets Memorial Committee are also really big on knowing the local history, of course, and we involve probably the legions in the area too.
Yeah, I want to stress that if you're interested in researching an individual, start with your appropriate county historical society. The chances are pretty good that they'll be able to point you in the right direction, get you off to a good start. We can help with people who served in the Civil War from all over Minnesota because of the index list that is in the back of the 2-volume set of books, Minnesota and the Civil and Indian Wars. That set of books was put out by the Minnesota Historical Society as a reprint of the original, but the Minnesota Historical Society wisely added an index, which was sadly lacking in the originals from the 1890s. And I would venture to guess that Blue Earth County and Brown County especially would have considerable indexed material on people who served in the military. Le Sueur County, I think you're going to have a challenge there. Sibley County, that could be problematic as well.
Arlene does a good job up at Sibley. It's hard to access they have limited hours. Same with LeSueur County, although their research center is accepting requests right now. I don't know if they're in person yet, but they're definitely taking questions. They're very active.
Yeah, they've got dedicated people. They're just lacking some of the resources that Nicollet County Historical Society and others like Brown and Blue Earth counties have.
We are fortunate.
Yeah.
Anything else to add? We're at almost 10 after 11. I think Cindy is our only member of the public still here. Steve had to sign off early, but he did. Thank you for the good information.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any activity on the chat. I'm not seeing Cindy popping back on. So I'm thinking that we're good here.
Yeah,
Thanks for,
Jessica, I have a question for you at the
oh,
end when everybody signed off.
oh,
So if
sure,
you-
I can hang on.
Yeah.
Oh, Cindy's gone.
Yeah.
So we can stop recording. I will do that here now. And then just to tag this on at the end here, we'll wrap up the military story of Nicollet County and join us back in June for conducting genealogy research at NCHS. And I'm sure that'll include some outside sources. Should be a good, fun one for everybody. A little piggyback on that last question we had on military history too, because of course, all of that starts with some good genealogy research. So I will stop recording and thanks everyone for attending.